Hello, everybody. I'm Kerim Munir from Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. It gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce one of my favorite people in psychiatry and child development, Tony Earls. Tony is a professor of public health and social medicine, but at the same time, primary appointment professor of human behavior and development, emeritus at the Harvard Chan School, as well as Harvard Medical School. And this is part of a exceptional history maker interviews that we have prepared, which is in a series of interviews that I've been doing with David Klein, who has been the chair of the history committee, and I'm now the co-chair of this committee. The media theater representations here involves a journey that I think we're going to start from a very early period for Tony. And we're borrowing from selected interviews that were done through the History Makers program, which is essentially an NGO video oral history collection, which is really an example to us all. And one of the participants under the medical biographies in this section is Tony. And so the video segments will depict in 4 parts the early period of Tony's childhood and development, moving on to his education in New Orleans, in Memphis, and subsequently in college and medical school. And then, which I think the videos will depict that. I won't take too much time describing those. And then moving on to his actual professional experience later on in part 3 and part 4. And after each part, we will take some episodes where we will discuss the session. The part 3 is particularly interesting because it involves his training in child psychiatry and public health in a number of venues. And again, I don't want to not mention that at this time, because I think the archive will give you a much better description of that. And the part 4 is really the part that is the ending, which is to do with his involvement in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, his work in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa on HIV/AIDS prevention, his Chicago neighborhood study, as well as many other intellectual work. And I think I will show you some slides of that as well. So let me give you, first of all, the participants in this session, and I want to thank them individually and also ask David Klein to give a few words as an introduction to this exceptional interview series. Dr. David Klein is a professor at University of Minnesota, and he has been the chair of the Academy History and Archives Committee, as I mentioned, and he's a distinguished child psychiatrist. We really very much benefited. I think this is his last Academy meeting, and he's stepping down from the History and Archives Committee, but we hope that he will continue to participate in many of these sessions in the future. The second person I want to introduce is my friend and colleague, Dr. Gordon Harper, who is a associate professor at Harvard Medical School, has been a teacher at Boston Children's Hospital, at Harvard Medical School, as well as working in many different state venues at the moment. And Gordon is the co-chair of the History and Archives Committee coming in. And finally, of course, we are really delighted to have Tony Earls with us, who's joined. And it's a bit strange, Tony, to have you and not necessarily have you talk, but we will use the video archive and then have your comments in the discussion and participate in the exchange that will, I hope to moderate. I think we have about 30 people participating, which is really great. This session is being recorded for your information. So thank you very much again for joining at this ungodly late hour, coinciding with your dinner. And we really value your participation and look forward to the discussion. And again, Janet, who is at the Academy, will be with us, Janet Stout. Thank you, Janet. She's been the facilitator or the liaison for the History and Archives Committee, and we really very much appreciate all your help over the years, and also in particular in this session. So David Klein, I would like to ask you to maybe say a few words in terms of the exceptionalism series that you had started initially with Robert Coles, and we then followed up with a number of other people, including Michael Rutter and Carola Eisenberg. Thank you. So I would like to leave the microphone and give it to David if he's able to. I can't see you, David, but if you can't join with the audio, then we can move on. Okay, I think David had some connection issues, so we'll come back to that. The sources for this session include the History Maker interviews, the medical biographies, as I mentioned, focusing on Tony's work. There is an audio tape that Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot interview for her book on African Americans I Have Known Rivers, which is an interview that she also conducted with Tony, and I'm going to play an audio of that. I'm going to also play some segments from the Leon Eisenberg Award interviews with Carola Eisenberg that we took in 2018, before Carola passed away this year in April. And I also want to mention the book that we will sort of highlight that was published in 2020 by the Harvard University Press, Belknap Press of Harvard University, co-authors Felton, Earls, and Maya Carlson. And I don't think that anything that we say about Tony goes without saying about Maya, as the book also depicts Tony, and I want to emphasize that it's been a partnership, it's been a scientific partnership, a friendship, as well as a marriage that you've been sort of having the pleasure of having Maya's company over the years. So this book is very important, and I would advise sort of, and there's been a review of it actually in the American Academy Journal by Gordon, which book review, which I would also encourage you to read. There are a number of other articles that Tony has written, which I won't essentially specifically talk about, but there is one article, Toward the Science of Citizenship, in the American Journal of Ortho Psychiatry, that sort of piqued my eye. And then, of course, an article that I think we'll come back to towards the end in his interview, Darwin and Lincoln, Their Legacy of Human Dignity. And of course, the article in Science that I want to emphasize in terms of its impact in the scientific literature, funded in part by the MacArthur Foundation, Neighborhoods and Violent Crime, a multi-level study of collective efficacy. And there will be a section on describing what we mean by collective efficacy. So, David, can you hear me now? Can you say something? Introduction. Microphone? Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kerwin. Am I coming through? Can you hear me?
Perfect. Thanks.
Yes. Okay. I'll speak for him. I feel special kinship with Tony Earls because we both attended the University of Wisconsin in Madison in medical school. And although our paths didn't cross, we have a kinship because there was the Wisconsin idea that spreads to all of its students and to all the state, which is to be exceptional, people, and to see and reach your highest goal of achievement that you can attain. Over the 23 years that I've been chair and co-chair of the History Committee, we have emphasized several aspects. The one of which is Kerwin's talking about tonight is the study of exceptionalism. This came about by us first just talking and getting videographs of senior people in the psychiatry. As you know, our society began in 1953, and when I came into the picture as the historical chair, it was 1998, and the senior members of our society were, some have passed, some are very, very present, and we set out to interview them and to hear about their stories about how they came into child psychiatry and what they remembered of the early days. And those were interesting stories. But then we also noted that some were even exceptional beyond just being early members. And so we set out especially to interview and study them and interview them. One such example was Robert Coles, who's a professor at Harvard, now emeritus, who agreed to give us 6 interviews, all lasting about 2 to 3 hours, that we videoed in his home in Concord, Massachusetts. And we got his life story and sat with him as he spoke about it. And we wanted to find out how he became so successful. And the story is not simple, and it's too long to tell. But he had a force within him that was championed by his 2 parents to make something of himself, and he navigated his life in such a way that he became an outstanding child adolescent psychiatrist and a great citizen of America. And we studied other people as well, but not as extensively as we did with Robert. So again, the exceptional is what we're looking at, and the creativity is what we're looking at, and we're hoping that by you all listening to these stories, you will find your own special niche that will stimulate you and inspire you. And now, so what did we learn of all this? Well, it's hard to put it in a word, but let me tell you a kind of a simple joke that I heard. It has to do with Beethoven, who, as you know, was deaf and never married, but he had friends, lady friends, but they eventually got tired of him because of getting old and so on. So this happened as he was getting old and more deaf, and his lady friend said, finally, well, I'm done with you, Ludwig. We're done. I can't be with you anymore. And he said, oh, you can't leave me. And she said, well, I am leaving you. And he said, but you can't leave me. I need you. I need you. She said, I am leaving. And he said, but you're my full inspiration, my full inspiration. And she said, your inspiration, that makes me laugh. Ha, 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 ha. Ha, 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 ha. Well, there was his creation. So staying lighthearted, I guess, may welcome creativity within our realm. So I pass it back to you now, Kerim.
Thank you. Gordon, do you want to say a few words about the book and because I know that you're sort of a very long-standing colleague to Johnny. I just wanted to say just introductory.
Kerim, I'm glad to contribute here, partly because I may be interested to hear if there's anybody else besides Maya who's known Tony as long as I have, I first met Tony when I was a first-year resident at the Mass General, and Tony was a senior resident. In fact, he was the chief resident on the inpatient service. And so it was very special to have him in the group of senior. Actually, I think there were two chief residents. He was the one of them. And so we got to know each other then before he went to England to work and his work beginning in epidemiology. And that was the result both of Tony's interest and of Leon Eisenberg's recognition that Tony had something very special to develop in this area of epidemiology. So Tony worked with the name in England, the epidemiology and the Isle of Wight study, and then came and did a similar study, epidemiological study on Martha's Vineyard, before getting into the neighborhood work that Kerim referred to before, initially in Chicago and later in Boston. And that's a big part of the book that I reviewed this in the Orange Journal last February, I think. So I've known Tony close and at a distance as he's gone to Boston, to England, to St. Louis, back to Boston. And in the meantime, had more connections internationally, and than any other child psychiatrist I can think of. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this group, paying tribute to him and learning from his experience in this event that Kerim and David have organized. So it's a great pleasure, and glad to see Tony and Maya in and off, on and off the camera tonight. And it's, as Kerim said, it's a tough hour to have a meeting together, but it's a good cause to have a good meeting.
Thank you, Gordon. The floor is open for anyone else who knows Tony and wants to say something at the outset. I think come out and declare yourselves. Just at least for a few minutes to say hello. Otherwise, we'll just get started. Okay, so I'm going to start with the original, sort of the tape one, which has to do with the, the early childhood and early memories growing up, and this is fascinating. So I'm going to share my screen and start, and this is sort of online sharing. See the screen with Tony's picture or not? Let me see. Again, share screen. Can you see this screen? Can you share with Tony's picture? Can you see it?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. All right. Okay.
Did you know her? Oh, I knew her very well. Yeah. I consider myself fortunate because I knew 3 of my grandparents very well. I mean,
maternal grandpa.
Every day, and certainly every week. And when we get to my maternal grandmother, lived next door to her. So, but anyway, my maternal grandmother was a dominant figure. My memory is that she was a large person and beautiful and articulate and strong-willed. My cousin, who I said gave me the nickname Herbert, was raised by my grandmother. That at some point she took him from Mildred, my mother's sister. Mildred was having some problems, and Herbert seemed to be a very strong-willed boy. And I remember that Beatrice took Herbert under her wing and meant to control him. And it was her destiny to control him, not Clarence. I mean, Clarence was overwhelmed by Herbert and the decision to take him to the house. But this was Beatrice's reason for being in many ways. That's the kind of person she was.
How do you remember your mother in terms of her personality? What was she like? How do you remember her?
Well, my mother was kind, extraordinarily sensitive of other people's feelings, and reflecting that all the time. I was her first child, and her only child for 7 years. And I think we were extraordinarily close. And I think I incorporated.
I see. Tell me about your other sibling or siblings,
Mhm.
yeah, their names and roughly when they were born.
So I have 7 years later, Carol came along, my first sister. Her name is Carol Franklin, and she lives in Detroit, Michigan now. 2 years later, Philip came along. Philip lives in Newport News, Virginia Beach, actually. And then 18 years later, Len was born.
Len or Len?
Len,
Len.
Lynne was born. I remember that I was a freshman in college when Len was born. So that's my second sister, third sibling, and she lives in Atlanta.
So next story, so fathers.
Tell me about your father, his name, and when he was born and where.
My father's name was Felton, the second, so I'm Felton the third. And he was born September 27th, 1915. Again, I don't know for sure that he was born in New Orleans, but he grew up in New Orleans. And never really talked about a rural connection, unlike my mother and Clarence and Beatrice, who would make reference often to the rural parts of Louisiana that they had come from.
What did your father tell you about his growing up years? Any stories that you remember, especially that he would tell and share with you?
Well, my father was a pretty quiet, self-contained person. And he didn't talk very much about his growing up. I inferred much of what I know about my father's growing up from my grandmother, his mother, who at various times would just kind of open up to me, and talk about the past, about her history, about raising my father, and about, not in much detail, but about her relationship with Felton first.
Okay, where was she from? His mother.
Well, she was from a rural part of Louisiana as well, and I can't really remember the name of the little town, but it's all around, they all came from around Alexandria, Louisiana, which is about 100 miles from New Orleans.
And her name? Your father's mother?
Alberta.
Alberta, okay. What about his father, your paternal grandfather?
Well, he's the mystery man. Alberta had a tough time with him, and didn't go into detail about what that meant. But there were a number of years in which he was in and out of the picture. So it sounds like by the time that my father's memory would have served him for many years, that his father, my grandfather, was mostly out of the picture. And so he considered himself as growing up without a father, but with uncles, my grandmother's brothers, who did quite an adequate job of substituting. So many of his connections, though again not discussed in much detail with me, were many of his connections to men as mentors and guides and that sort of thing were through Mac, Uncle Mac, and Oscar, the two brothers of Alberta.
Thank you.
What is your earliest memory of growing up in New Orleans? How far back can you remember? What were some of the incidents that still you can still think
The
of?
earliest memories, we lived, I think I was born in public housing project called the Erato Street Project.
Could you spell that for me?
ERATO. And that's the way people in New Orleans pronounce that word. It was a new public housing. And I remember it being a good place. My father was a manager of the project. And so there was something special about that. I don't know exactly how that translates into prestige, but he was somebody who was known in the community, respected in the community, and our household benefited, in some ways from that. So I remember that as being a good place. I have memories of how it looked, and but mostly I have a memory of being pretty secure, in that setting. Now, I was born in 1942. In 44, he went to the army. He was enlisted in the army and went to the Pacific, the Philippines, and was away for a year. I don't remember that so much, but I do remember him coming back. So I was about 4 years old. And I remember that there was a certain amount of disruption associated with that, he went to various army posts. So he didn't come back to New Orleans. He went to Georgia someplace, Fort Benning, I think it was. Then he went to Oklahoma. And my mother and I followed him to some extent. I mean, we went to Atlanta, we went wherever Fort Benning is. We went there, and then we went to Oklahoma, and then we came back to New Orleans. And it kind of seemed like we're in a tizzy, trying to keep up with this guy.
How old were you when you finally came back to New Orleans with your parents and settled?
Well, it's complicated. That we got back to New Orleans, and he came back to New Orleans in 45, 46. And then in 48, I'm estimating, he got a job. He got his first new job being back on this side as a postal clerk. And his job was to sort mail on the train between New Orleans and Houston. And so again, he was on the road traveling, and we were trying to keep up with him. And so I have a very vivid memory of the date at which the family decided to move to Houston, because he was spending more time in Houston. And I actually went to first grade in Houston. And a lot of, that's when my memory starts to consolidate. Is that. And we came back to New Orleans a year later.
Okay, tell me about that first year in Houston. You started school, grade 1, kindergarten.
Yeah, first grade.
What do you remember about that year?
I remember that it was, I enjoyed being in school, but I had a feeling of being displaced, and that unlike other kids, that there was something uncertain about my being there. And I mean, looking back on it, it was because it was sort of like any day we could make the decision to move back to New Orleans. So I remember some incidents that I got into, sort of fights with kids, or having little accidents here and there. And my thinking about that is that it was a reflection of insecurity I had about not knowing where I was. Now, I also think I was reflecting a lot of my mother's distress. And I think that what I'm telling you now about my memories is all mixed up with comments and feelings that she had as well.
Did she work and have an
No,
occupation at
no.
any age? She didn't.
No, I don't think ever in my growing up she worked outside the house.
Okay. Mhm. So you come back to New Orleans for grade 2?
Yeah,
What school did you attend?
McDonald, number 6 in this case.
And you were there for how long? Through grade 6, grade 8?
Yeah, I think it was, I went up to middle school, so grade 6, and then I went to a school called Samuel J. Green Junior High School, and went to 9th grade when the big trauma in my life occurred. And that was a decision my father made to move to Memphis, Tennessee. And so we were, let me use the word plucked out of New Orleans. And family moved to Memphis, and that's where they stayed for right up to the end of my father's life, 30 years, 40 years. And I went to high school in Memphis.
In high school, okay.
Booker T. Washington High School.
In New Orleans, your elementary and junior high school years, were there any particular teachers that were particularly influential in your life at that time? Any teachers you recall?
2 teachers. One was a 3rd grade teacher, and my memories of her name was Mrs. Halsey. I did very well in 3rd grade. It must have been some kind of transition in my educational career, because when I came back from Houston, there was some doubt in the New Orleans public school evaluation that I was ready for 2nd grade. And so there was this sort of tentative placement of me in 2nd grade, but a warning to my mother, I suppose my father, that if I didn't make it, then I'd have to repeat that grade. I'd have to repeat 2nd grade. Well, somehow I made it through that year, got to 3rd grade, and it was like the heavens opened up. The sun came through. I really belonged there. This teacher loved me, and I settled in to being a good student. So I think that, that served me well for the rest of my educational career.
Who was the second teacher that you
The
remember
second teacher was a French teacher I had, that in New Orleans you were required to take French in whatever grade it was, 5th or 6th grade. And I remember this guy as being one of the most eloquent men I had ever seen. That it must be because he spoke French, and English. But there was something about his dress and his demeanor that reflected a really cosmopolitan person, a person who wasn't like other people in my community. And I found that enthralling in many ways. So, I didn't do that well. I mean, I don't remember. I remember a little French, but it's not like he started me on the pathway of using, becoming proficient in the language. It was more just the kind of ambience of this man as a teacher in a classroom, bringing much more of the world to the classroom than I'd ever seen before.
Up through your middle school years before you went to Memphis, how do you recall segregation in New Orleans as a child and an early teenager?
Confusing. And it was confusing partly because of skin tone. That in junior high school, often I take a bus from school back home, and the buses were segregated, and there was a portable sign that one could move back and forth on buses to, depending on the proportion of blacks who were on the bus. And frequently I'd get on the bus with my schoolmates, And some of them could pass for white. And so they'd play a game with the bus driver and with us, you know, sort of showing us that they could sit in front of the sign while we had to sit in back of the sign and so forth. And that caused some tension, you know, some rivalry, some not fights necessarily, but it was the uneasiness, you know, that here we all are sitting on this bus playing this game, you know, this race skin tone game, basically. And isn't it ridiculous? I mean, who came up with this screwed up idea, you know, of dividing people like this?
In your late elementary grade experiences and moving into middle school, did you have at that time any notion of thought about what you wanted to be as an adult, career-wise?
Oh yeah. I mean, maybe third grade or fourth grade, I got a chemistry set. My father, for Christmas, you know, bought me a chemistry set, and boy, did I ever get tracked into the magic. You know, it was like magic that you could mix things together and create new things, and that you had to calculate it, and you know, it wasn't just something that would happen without your being conscientious about it, knowledgeable about it. So yeah, I was tracked into science pretty early.
So, Tony, I just want to let you know that you have something very common with Charles Darwin, because he was called Gas in the high school at Shrewsbury because of his interest in chemistry and experiments. Just, I couldn't resist but tell you that.
Great.
Moving to the very exceptional sort of ninth grade, what Tony was alluding to now, next episodes.
Dr. Earls, a turning point in your life came, as you were explaining, when your father took work in Memphis, Tennessee. And this was the end of your junior high years.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that transition?
Well, it was disruptive to me, that I hadn't planned this. It wasn't my decision, you know, and it was fairly abrupt as I look back at it. I started ninth grade, which is the upper level of junior high school in New Orleans, and felt, you know, like I was gaining control over the city, over my life, over girlfriends, over, you know, other kinds of activities and so forth. And so to be suddenly plucked out of that environment. And I also love New Orleans.
What did you like about it?
Music. Food comes right behind music, but music. And there's a whole story about my Uncle Oscar. I'll show you a photograph of. I started playing clarinet when I was 5 years old. There's a lot of music going on in my environment, you know. So I got to Memphis, and it seemed to me that I'd gone back in time 20, 30 years, you know, like before I was born, that people didn't talk right. They didn't celebrate. There was no Mardi Gras. There was no carnival. There's no jazz. There's dull food. A lot of emphasis on sports, you know, like basketball was more important than music, you know, how could that be? So I didn't feel like I fitted in, and given that this wasn't my choice, it's tough. It was a big high school. I went to a much larger high school than I was in. And rather than being at the top of the rank in ninth grade in junior high school, suddenly I was at the bottom of the rank in ninth grade in a conventional four-year high school. So the first year I was in, and the other thing is that it was sort of like they had a dress code at this school. That kids were not to wear blue jeans and that sort of thing. And I found it very difficult to get into that, I didn't understand it very well. But I had a tough time in ninth grade. I think I eventually adjusted and did all right at the high school and benefited from being at the high school.
What high school did you attend in Memphis?
It's Booker T. Washington High School.
Why did your father relocate there?
Well, it was job related. That he had been in the Postal Service since 1947 or 48, and had earned officer status in the United States Army under Dwight Eisenhower, who was a general and who desegregated the Army, and had kept certain connections with Republicans. And as a large Black Republican network of accomplished people in the South, through that network, he kept gaining status in the post office department. And the move to Memphis was to become a regional manager of several states in the South. So it was a big promotion for him. And I remember that we moved in 1955. And I remember very distinctly the encroaching election in 1960, where Richard Nixon was running against John Kennedy. My father's stake was with Nixon. If Nixon had won, there might have been a chance for him to go to Washington, in the post office department. And the tension in the House was quite significant. And of course, the outcome was surprising to many people, but a little devastating to him.
Graduated from Booker T. Washington High School in 1959. 1959. What came next in your life following high school graduation?
Well, I had all kinds of aspirations about college. I ended up going to Howard. It wasn't my first choice. My first choice was Northwestern, but the high school had made a decision not to send my transcript to Northwestern, and I didn't know that. So I did all of my parts of taking the exam, the last step to the exam, and paying money that I had earned for matriculation fee and filling out the application and having my parents, fill out their part of the application and that sort of thing. And then as payday encroaches, and I'm not getting letters at all, I went to the principal's office, a guy named Blair Hunt, and said, I'm confused. I know I've done all of my part to complete this application. And so the secretary says, quietly, she said, I think you have to see Mr. Hunt about this. So I went to see him, and he told me that he had made a decision not to send my transcript to Northwestern because he didn't think we were ready to function in school like that. So I lost the opportunity to go to Northwestern that year, and I did get a scholarship to some other schools, including Dillard in New Orleans, which is where my father went. But I wanted to venture out in the world, so I went to Howard. That was I almost said the next best choice for me. Turns out it was a wonderful choice for me. So.
Tell me about your undergraduate years at Howard. What did you major in?
Chemistry. When I was in 11th grade at Booker T. Washington, I was named Mr. Chemistry. I mean, I was obsessed. There's no question about that. I majored in chemistry and took every chemistry course that you can take at Howard, and for all practical purposes, saw myself becoming a professional chemist. Never really thought very much else about things. I kind of took a little biology and required courses in other places, but my passion was.
Who were some of the memorable chemistry professors that you had?
Oh, there was a guy named Hakala. Never quite figured out, he might have been Polish or I think it's Lithuanian actually. But he was my freshman chemistry teacher. And it was that freshman general chemistry course was the dividing point, that I remember him coming in class, and there might have been 150 people in the class, students in the class. And he began the first lecture by saying he wanted the students to get to know each other. So would you turn to the person on the right and introduce yourself, and then alternatively turn to the person on the left? He said, now you know some of your classmates. He said, now one of those people you just met will not be here next semester. And it was sort of, uphill from that point on. I'm blocking the name of the other guy, but the two of us, a guy who went on to be the first Black student at Johns Hopkins Medical School, and I made the top grades in the chemistry class for that year. And we were encouraged to stay in chemistry, and take physical chemistry and biological chemistry.
Beyond your
Organic.
science studies at Howard, outside the classroom, what other kind of things did you like to do? Were you involved in?
Well, I got pulled into civil rights, and part of it was growing up in Memphis. That in the when I moved to Memphis in 1955, I think I was telling you about how much I didn't like the food and the absence of music. But I didn't tell you that while my father and I were driving through Mississippi, I mean, this is the way I remembered it, up Highway 55 or 61, from New Orleans to Memphis. And my sort of agonizing, where the hell am I going? Where is he taking me? That when we got to Memphis and read the paper, we read the story of Emmett Till. That it was in the summer of 1955, when we were moving to Memphis, that the Till story broke. And that convinced me, that I had not gone north by driving 350 miles. But at any rate, I got pulled into civil rights action in Memphis while in high school. And by the time I got to Howard in 59, 60, the movement was now really crystallizing. I mean, so I marched, I did sit-ins in Washington. When I'd come home, I marched to Mississippi. And much of my extracurricular life at Howard was surrounded by trying to make sense out of what my role would be in a movement. I mean, how far could I go? How politically, was I willing to lose time from school and that sort of thing.
Medical school application.
After graduating from Howard University with a degree in chemistry, what came next in your life?
I went to medical school, and it was a lot of pressure from my father to not go into into a company or graduate school in chemistry. That he put a lot of pressure on me to go to medical school as a way of giving me more of a foundation to make a choice about what I really wanted to do. It was almost like going on to graduate school again. So I gave in to the pressure and applied to 2 medical schools. One was the University of Tennessee in Memphis, and the other was Howard. And I mean, because I hadn't taken much biology and whatever, I didn't really think I had that much of a chance. My heart wasn't in it. So went to the University of Tennessee. There'd never been a Black student at the University of Tennessee before. And they kind of looked at me, looked at my father, and said, "We're not willing to take the risk. We're not ready for this yet." I mean, in so many words, that's what they said. And I was relieved, to tell you the truth about it. I got in Howard and couldn't wiggle out of it. So I went to medical school.
How do you remember those years at
Well, I
Howard?
didn't want to be in medical school. I wasn't terribly excited about taking care of sick people. It wasn't a passion of mine. The science was what I was really interested in. I also, on one November day, my freshman year in medical school, was sort of sitting there in a class, again, of 120 people or so, and a messenger ran in the classroom and told the instructor, a guy named Montague Cobb, was the anatomy instructor, ran in the class and told Cobb that the President of the United States had just been assassinated, November 1963. And we didn't believe it. But coming out of that classroom and understanding that it really had happened was another shock about the social political world in which I live. This is another layer on civil rights.
What happened?
Nothing. It's not you, is it?
No.
You didn't touch anything. Did you?
Can everyone hear the video?
No.
I can't.
Anybody else?
Medical school.
Okay.
There's
Yeah.
a financial obligation that you
Hold on.
I can hear it.
issue upstream about how this society was organized, what was happening in the world. And somehow being in medical school was a long way from embracing and trying to solve and being a part of the solution of those upstream problems. So it's hard to drop out of medical school. There's a big financial obligation that you're making and whatever. So I made it through medical school.
We're getting to I think the next two clips, and we're getting to the first break. And then we'll have a session for discussion.
You graduated from Howard Medical School, and you were particularly interested in taking care of sick people, and you didn't do a residency then. You didn't go on.
No, I went right into a laboratory.
Where?
Yeah, University of Wisconsin. I went into brain science, neurophysiology, and for all intents and purposes, that sort of saw the possibility of doing a postdoctoral fellowship and coming back to Howard and teaching physiology. And
Why neurophysiology? Why did you zero in on that piece? What had influenced?
Well,
you?
I'd been interested in brain chemistry. I mean, so my chemical interest in medical school ended up being biochemistry of the nervous system. And so I went into brain sciences. And even though I was doing electrical experiments in the electrical parts of the nervous system, my interest was still basically in chemistry.
So at the University of Wisconsin, you got an advanced degree, another degree from there? Or you
No, I didn't get an advanced degree. I worked in a laboratory as a postdoctoral fellow and got very good training. I mean, it was one of the best places in the world to be. And the plan was for me to stay there for 3 years. And there would be no doubt that coming out of that laboratory, I could get a job almost anywhere I wanted to. So, I was doing important research. I was publishing papers. I didn't need a PhD. I mean, I was in the right place to get the experience.
You were there 3 years or less?
Well, another catastrophic event occurred, equivalent to Emmett Till.
What was that?
John Kennedy, and that was Martin Luther King. I was in a lab doing my work when Martin Luther King was killed. And because I grew up in Memphis. I knew instantly the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. I knew where it happened. I could picture that. I used to pass there all the time, walking to high school, walking to Booker T. Washington High School.
How did you feel at that very moment when you heard what had happened?
That, that the world had just ended. That I spent a lot of time in the 60s migrating back and forth between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And Howard was a good place to be because King came, Malcolm X came. There was a lot of intellectual understanding and interpretation of these two points of view. When Malcolm was killed in '65, what we saw was a convergence. I mean, that Malcolm was becoming universal. He was becoming international. And it seemed that cutting off his legs was, in part motivated by the fact this guy's going too far. And that's exactly the case, even more powerfully represented in King. King was now making a connection between poor white people and poor black people, between discrimination and racism in the United States and the war in Vietnam. And so his assassination, I interpreted as calculated and on a mission of the government of the United States. That's the way I saw it. And that one, could not remain an ordinary citizen of the United States and not react to this. And it would take your whole life to react to it. I couldn't stay in a lab and react to this. I had to do something else.
So what'd you do?
Well, I was confused. I looked at what my skills were. I tried to figure out a way to be useful, to be connected. I decided the most useful thing that I had was this MD degree. So I went to Harlem. It was my imagination of where I was really needed, and decided to bite, the bullet. And it's a strange metaphor, and do an internship, make myself into a doctor, but a children's doctor, who would be invested in the next generation of American citizens. And in that way, pick up whatever pieces of Martin Luther King's effort I could, and try to apply it to the idea that this society could become a better society.
Before the next two short segments before the break, I want to read from Tony and Mary's book, Voice, Choice, and Action, on this segment, which I think Tony's journey, which he writes about in the introduction. My response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, was to seek a new career. I had been on a 36-hour stretch in a soundproof laboratory, mapping the reception of acoustical tones across the surface of a cat's brain. When I emerged, the campus was in uproar. And where have I been? It happened that I knew the street where King was shot like the back of my hand. Once upon a time, my father's promotion required our family to move from New Orleans to Memphis, where I attended Booker T. Washington High School, a mile up the road. I passed the Lorraine Motel and glimpsed that balcony every day on my walk to school. When I heard about the assassination, visual images of the murder scene flooded my consciousness. From that day, I never again felt comfortable, too far removed from the world. With the laboratory and surgical suite no longer seeming relevant, my calling became to continue the human rights struggle that King led. I knew, too, that in the creation of a just society, children must be involved. Leaving my research career behind, I left Madison to begin an internship in pediatrics at New York City's Metropolitan Hospital. So we move on to the next one.
And so you did a residency in pediatrics?
So I did an internship in pediatrics, and I met various people, and ended up deciding to do psychiatry, and came here to Boston in 1970 to start a residency in psychiatry at Mass General Hospital.
Now, was that child or adult? Because I read two different things.
Yeah, well, you have to do adult first
I see.
before you do child. So I was pretty convinced that I was going to be a child psychiatrist, but you have to do adult. You have to train in adult psychiatry first. So I started at Mass General, did my adult psychiatry there, and then went to London.
How long were you at Mass General?
For 2.5, 3 years.
And that was what time again?
It was 1970 to 1973.
Okay.
And then I went to London for a year to do child psychiatry, and then came back here.
I see. How'd you find Boston when you came to Mass General? How do you remember the city when you first came?
I was disappointed in the city. I was completely unprepared for the remoteness and the coldness of people. I'd speak to people, they wouldn't speak back. I'd ask directions, and people would deliberately give me the wrong directions, I thought, and kind of feel good about the fact that they had steered me in the wrong way. And for a period of time, I thought that it was something about me. That maybe because I was from the South, and maybe because my speech was different. They could reference me outside of Boston. But then I started to notice that that's really the way they treated each other, and that this was a kind of endemic cultural thing in New England. That people really didn't engage each other very much spontaneously. So I must confess I never liked that very much.
I realized how cold my home city was, New Bedford, Boston. When I first went to New Orleans, that was my very first trip to the South, was New Orleans. I worked for Xerox. I'll tell you about it later, And then I made more travels into the South, and then I could compare. And I said, well, we are not, friendly people.
It's
Because I found the South so open and relaxed, with blacks and whites. Get back up, because this is very important, and I jumped over it. You met your wife at the University of Wisconsin?
I did.
Her name, and just tell me about
her name is Mary Carlson. We met in 1967 in this laboratory of neurophysiology. And the way that we met, we ended up being in the same office, but before I got to the lab, I was still in Washington and Howard, so I'd made up my mind that I was going to move out to Madison, Wisconsin. The director of the lab told me that, knowing that I was from New Orleans, that there was another person in the lab who was from New Orleans. So, that this is an important connection to make, when you're going to Madison, Wisconsin. So when I got to Madison, I remember going in the office with the other postdocs and saying, now, who is from New Orleans? And it turns out that it was Mary, that she wasn't from New Orleans, that she'd gone to Tulane and had lived in New Orleans for several years and had just moved back from New Orleans to Madison, Wisconsin. She's actually from Madison, Wisconsin. So she had moved back home to be in this laboratory. And it turns out that we had lived on the same street, that she had lived about a half a mile on Chestnut Street from where I grew up. So that's kind of interesting,
So what year did you get married? You and Mary?
We got married in 1971. So, we got to know each other. And she went through my meanderings about what I'm going to do. I'm not, she realized and was with me
So she was here in Boston when you were here at Mass
Yeah,
General?
yeah. And she was with me in the lab when I made a decision to leave the lab and to leave.
What did she do while you were at Mass General doing? Yeah.
She worked at MIT. She stayed in brain sciences.
I see.
And so she got a job
Mhm.
at MIT.
And did she go to London with you also?
She did, yeah.
Mhm.
And our daughter, my second daughter,
Mhm.
I have a daughter by a former marriage
Mhm.
of Mary's.
Mhm.
My first daughter,
Mhm.
Lee. My second daughter, Tanya, was born in London
Okay.
in 1974.
Okay. And what is Tanya doing today?
Tanya and her family, her husband and my granddaughter, whose name is Zenzi, lives with us.
Uh-huh.
So we share a house in
Okay.
Cambridge, and she teaches at Cambridge French and Latin School,
Okay.
which is the high school in Cambridge.
Mhm. And your other daughter, Lee, how do you spell Lee?
Leighh.
Yeah, where is she?
Lee lives in Newton, so not very far away.
Mhm.
I see her all the time with her husband
Mhm.
and 3 grandchildren.
Thank you. So we're going to take a first break, and I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you. So the floor is open for discussion, and I labeled this series on Tony, Young Citizens to Heal Democracy, once kindled by Dr. Martin Luther King. And we stopped at that turning point here. The other very traumatic event that I think Tony alludes to is move to Memphis. And ironically, the fact that Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis is, so I like to have your comments, and I will monitor the chat room. And if you want to speak out, please unmute yourselves and ask a question. Tony, I know, is unmuted and will respond. David and Gordon, you too. Thank you. Gordon, you want to say something?
A question, picking up on one of the things Tony said. He said when he first got to Boston, I think people noticed that his speech was different. He spoke like somebody coming from the South, and obviously different from the way people growing up in New England were speaking. And I was curious because if one were to listen to Tony now, one wouldn't immediately think of growing up in the South. And I was interested in the story behind that.
Well, New Orleans was a very unique place. It was French, it was Spanish, and it was English. And historically, those languages and dialects have shaped the way people from New Orleans speak. If you go 50 miles out of New Orleans to Baton Rouge or Alexandria or Jackson, Mississippi, you're in the South. You're not, and you no longer pick up the more interesting, I think, speech, and the more universal it is.
Yep.
But you came to Boston with speech characteristic of the South, which I think nobody would say listening to you now. What's the story behind that?
Well, I didn't have a Southern accent. I remember once that when I was 9 or 10 years old, my family went to Atlantic City and we were sitting at a drugstore counter, a lunch counter. And the guys behind the counter said, "I know where you're from. You're from Brooklyn." And I thought that that was not a good idea. And so I was actually a little concerned that they aligned me with Brooklyn because I'd never been to Brooklyn and didn't know anything about it. I think that one of the reasons I love New Orleans is because it's unique in this way.
Right, I get it.
the language relates to music, and it relates to food, and it relates to celebrations that people have. It's a wonderful place to grow up.
Great. Thank you.
Anybody else? In my conversations with Tony regarding your move to Memphis, I think I recall, Tony, that you saying that you faced racism for the first time when you moved there, because while you were in New Orleans, you really were immersed in the ambiance of music and food and family and extended family, your uncles. And we have some pictures actually from the final version of the History Makers, which shows some of that, and you with the clarinet as well.
Good.
But yes, but I wanted to ask you again to make a comment on that to the larger group here.
About moving to Memphis.
Yes.
It was stunning to me that it was so backwards. And what was backward about it is that Black people had incorporated the negative ideas about African Americans being lazy, unproductive, inadequate in some way. I found that this was much more internalized attitude than it was in New Orleans, where it was a game that people played. That race was a game of how light your skin tone was, and whether or not your parents had gone to college or finished high school. Those were the things that mattered in terms of identifying people. That race was not necessarily a serious, injurious problem that people acquired. In Memphis, I don't want to call it backwards. That may be an overstatement. But people were not free to think and behave in ways that showed their independence and their freedom from racial life as a Black person. That you're supposed to be frightened, you're supposed to respect white people. I know one of the things I couldn't do was to say, yes, ma'am. I couldn't make myself say that. But most of my colleagues would say that to a white person or perhaps even a Black person. So language was very important. Yeah.
Dr. Hannah Stevens from University of Iowa has a question, Tony, for you. She's saying, thank you for sharing all of this. I'm curious what experiences you had that led you to decide that intervening with children, becoming a pediatric physician, to be so important. And then she actually added, similarly, why child psychiatry instead of or in addition to the pediatrics that you started?
Well, I hadn't been taught child psychiatry in medical school. I took a course in psychiatry, but it was all about adults. But what I learned is that many of the problems that adults had their origins in childhood, and that not having access to child psychiatry was a limiting factor in understanding adult psychiatry. The other thing that I thought was important is that Martin Luther King had been particularly, one of the most important events in his life was the massacre of 3 or 4 Black school children in Birmingham, Alabama. He protested that and wrote a letter from jail that emphasizes the importance of working with young people. That we're going to change the society, we have to go to its roots, and that means making up for what you call a deficit in your medical education. So I went to, I had a chance to do a rotation with Stella Chess, who was a great child psychiatrist at New York University. And the first patient I saw had a cerebellar tumor. He had a wide gait and was clumsy, and I immediately recognized his symptoms as being cerebellar. Stella loved that I picked up a neurological disease on her psychiatric rotation. And we became friends, and she talked me into going to Boston to visit Leon Eisenberg, who would certainly give me a most up-to-date and refined idea about what child psychiatrists can do and what they can't do. And I was so taken with Leon's broad view of psychiatry. He was as interested in the streets and the neighborhoods as he was the brain and the adrenal gland. And that to me was a synthesis of science and politics and clinical work. So I thought child psychiatry would be a very rich and rewarding aspect of medicine. And it has been absolutely that. Fascinating.
The next clip is going to be when I show the History Makers clip, your work in London. And of course, the name of Michael Rutter comes up. Having done the interview with Michael Rutter, I recall that he also was sent by Aubrey Lewis, Sir Aubrey Lewis, to come to New York to work with Stella Chess. A little bit before your time.
Right.
And of course, he knew Leon Eisenberg, and Aubrey Lewis sent him to Baltimore to meet Leon Eisenberg. So he's sort of you're following the same trajectory in a way, but sort of the other way around. Thank you very much, Hannah, for your question. Lloyd Williamson, one of the striking things about cities like Memphis was that there is less interaction with people from other parts of the country and the world. That is still the same. In many ways today, people often stay in their same circles and don't venture out to interact with others, other people, or cultures. Thank you for sharing how history shaped your life and career interests. Thank you, Dr. Williamson. So that's a comment on Memphis, and I think that's an important reflection.
You'll actually hear me say something about Chicago in that regard. When we first started thinking about Chicago as a place to do large city urban child development research, we went to Chicago and interviewed children living in different parts of the city. And we were struck by how insular the Black communities were. That a neighborhood could be 4 blocks from the lake, but children 11 and 12 years old had never seen the lake. They considered it dangerous to walk the 4 blocks or the 6 blocks from the neighborhood to the lake. And that's the same property that you're talking about in Memphis. The people were insular, afraid to venture out. That wasn't true of New Orleans. I could ride my bike anywhere I wanted in New Orleans and would feel that I'm not doing anything wrong. I may be exposing myself a bit, but not enough to make me stay at home.
Yeah. So if there are no further questions at this juncture, I'd like to share an audio, part of an audio that Tony has sent me from Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's recording regarding Tony, actually, part of the recording on her book, I Have Known Rivers. And I'm going to, I think it reflects upon some of the struggle about the apartheid movement that you got involved in. Let me share that. I will start at
for clues and why Black people hadn't not only understands but applauds the retaliation. This response from a pacifist is unnerving to both of us, and Tony uses an old story to gain access to these new feelings. In January of 1967, Tony went to Montreal to do a 6-week externship in neurosurgery at McGill University. He was in his senior year at medical school and was planning on becoming a neurosurgeon. While he was at McGill, he roomed with a Japanese man, a resident in neurosurgery, who didn't know much about the United States, but was very curious about the history of our country. One thing that puzzled him, Tony recalls, was the response of Black people to their oppression. He said that he understood the wars between the Indians and the white men who were trying to steal their homeland, but he never could understand why Black people hadn't fought harder, why Blacks hadn't waged real war. Tony remembers the many long evenings he spent trying to explain to his roommate the unique history of Black-white relations, the ways in which Blacks had struggled against oppression, fought discrimination, persevered against racism, non-violently waged a moral war, and occasionally raged violently. But the Japanese resident never got it. He continued to question why Black people did not fight back, Tony recalls. He kept minimizing my claims of Black struggle, saying that he could see no evidence of sustained and massive resistance. As Tony listened to his roommate's persistent questioning, he began to see his point of view and admit the partial truth in it. I remember having to eat that finally. He wore me down. Something what he was saying felt right, felt true. As Tony watched the footage of the fires burning in Los Angeles and witnessed the eruptions of violence, he kept thinking of his conversations with his Japanese roommate 25 years earlier. The echoes reverberated in his head as he watched Blacks strike back with violent rage. His usually gentle face looks hard and angry. It has made me question the idea of aggression, to consider the extent to which we must check it, contain it, deny it, the way we often refuse to admit the pain. There's a certain honor in not letting others take advantage of you. Retaliation may be your last possible way to express your humanity. These words come slowly, as if the idea of legitimate, appropriate, even honorable violence seems almost foreign to his code of ethics. It seems hard for Tony to admit that societal conditions have become so hopeless and obscene for Blacks that the only way African Americans can experience their humanity is to lash out violently. Until now, Tony has resisted this conclusion through the deaths of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, through the burning down of Watts, through the civil rights struggle in the 60s. But the Rodney King verdict and its aftermath have pushed him to a new place of questioning and desperation. We both feel the need to move beyond this anguished conversation. Hurt and pain are consuming Tony, manifesting in his watery red eyes, his raging words, in his striking out gestures, in his moments of weary resignation. I sit there feeling deeply identified but helpless. I search my mind to find a bridge to another place, a way to move on that will not minimize or deny our anger and pain, but will release us from dwelling on it.
Tony, if there's anything you like to correct on Sarah's soul-bearing reflections on your reflections.
Sarah is over the top, what to say. I mean, she depicts me in my most complicated sense of reality. And she does it poetically and accurately. That's what I have to say about Sarah's quote.
Okay, thank you. One of the things that I want to share with you also, in particular, Tony, when you were at Mass General Hospital, and I recall this is a period where Leon Eisenberg was recruited from Johns Hopkins in 1967, and he essentially was very much an empiricist, but also a very sort of a polymath and was very interested in many domains. But psychoanalysis was still quite prominent even at Mass General Hospital. And I recall Chester Pierce, who's I think you consider as one of your influences and mentors, told me once that he applied for psychoanalytic training and he was rejected. And the reason for the rejection was that he had too big a collective unconscious. I wonder what you thought about that era of psychoanalysis era where you were essentially in at the time in your training in psychiatry.
Well, I realized that psychoanalysis was metaphorical and non-empirical and remote from the kind of experiences that most people had where I was working in poor neighborhoods in New York and Boston. Those people weren't going to psychoanalysts. They were lucky if they were seeing a psychiatrist for their methadone treatment or domestic violence, drinking problems. Those kind of things didn't fit very well with what psychoanalysis was interested in, which was neuroses. And being able to talk through your neuroses in a way that was intelligible to the recipient, the psychiatrist or the nurse or whoever was taking care of you. So my view of psychoanalysis is that it wasn't relevant, that it may be dangerous because nobody knows that the goodwill of a psychiatrist, of a psychoanalyst, is carried through to patient. That I had patients who were suicidal, who had been in psychotherapy with psychoanalysts. So I knew it wasn't a cure. So Leon would say really harsh things about psychoanalysts. I remember him once saying in grand rounds that he thought that a grown man would not understand why you are interested in psychoanalysis. That it's immature and inappropriate. And I was a student of Eisenberg, and I was an empiricist.
So I want to pass on Dr. Andreas Sorensen's comment. I started as a chemical engineer, then decided to change to psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry, and have been pulled towards homelessness, being financially and volunteering at homeless programs, to particularly here in Reno, Nevada. Thank you very much for your comment. So I want to move on to the period. We actually have done an hour and a half, so it's halfway through. I'm not going to take a break, but of course you're welcome to take a brief break yourselves at any time. I'm going to move on to the History Makers segment 3, and 4. And these are the professional research, career development, and research projects that Tony engaged in, with tape 4 essentially reflecting upon the apartheid movement, his musical interests and some other interests, Charles Darwin, his article on Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln, reflections upon his life, and then there are some photographs. And after that, I want to show you 2 video segments that I did as part of the Leon Eisenberg Award, and 1 segment, of course, with Carola Eisenberg, as I mentioned. And so I believe we do have time to all that and more. So I'm going to, without further ado, share my screen and go on to the next segment.
Mm.
Dr. Earls, you completed a adult psychiatry residency at Mass General Hospital, and then what was the next step? Where did you go from there?
Well, my interest was in doing research in child psychiatry. And it probably reflects a kind of orientation that I talked about a long time before, and that is that my interest never was deeply organized around taking care of patients. My issue was, how does one do research that addresses not just sick children, but what in society drives them to not do well in life? So I looked around with mentors and various other people about where could I go to really train myself to be that kind of child psychiatrist. And at that point in history, it was London. So I went to the Hospital for Sick Children in London to do my training in child psychiatry with the understanding that I'd be a researcher, that I'd come out of it with research experience and publications and skills and that sort of thing, that I could come back to Harvard or someplace like that and do research.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to study epidemiology
Mm-hmm.
and statistics in public health.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was in London for a year and a half, I did research.
Mm-hmm.
I did a little bit of patient care, but 75–80% of my time was either taking courses in epidemiology or actually doing research.
What was the nature of the research that you did there?
The research was on the problems that West Indian children were having as immigrants, first-generation immigrants in London. So I chose a community, did a random sample of immigrants. And there were immigrants from Pakistan as well as from the West Indies, and those from the West Indies from all over the English-speaking West Indies. Mm. And I did a study of the behavioral problems of 3-year-old children living in this part of London.
Then you, when you finished that work, your coursework and research, you came back to...
I came back to a faculty position at Harvard. So the understanding was that if you succeed in developing these skills and publishing your work and so forth, I would get a faculty appointment at Harvard Medical School. I came back in 74, 75, and joined the faculty and took up doing research here in the United States.
Well, tell me about those research experiences upon coming to Harvard.
Well, my first independent research project was to do a study like the one I'd done in England with preschool children. But in this case, I had to choose a population that I wanted to study, and I chose to study children in Martha's Vineyard. These were children who were year-round residents. I mean, living in families of year-round residents. And I did that because it's a captive population, that I could get the birth records of every child born on Martha's Vineyard, and then track that child with, almost 100% accuracy, because most people born on the island stayed there for, 10 or 15 years until I graduated from high school. So to me, it was a kind of captive population that I could keep track of everybody during the time that they were growing up. And I had very good support from the school department and from local doctors on the island, so that I could get records from the police and from the schools and from the doctors to have a kind of complete history of these kids.
I live on Martha's Vineyard.
You do?
Full time.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I know the vineyard pretty well.
Well, I've been there. I'm a year-round resident.
Yeah.
Been there for 40 years, not full time. I moved there 1995. I had a Schomburg fellowship in New York. I went to the vineyard to write, and I lived there, and so I've been involved.
Well,
This is fascinating.
my studies were I started in 1976 and studied every child born on the vineyard from 1976 to 1981.
Jeez. Rufus Shorter was the...
I know Rufus, and I know his wife.
I know Vera very well.
Rufus was one of the people, when I said the school was supportive,
Yeah,
well,
I'm sure he was. I will see her tomorrow. Vera. It's fascinating. Martha's Vineyard. What other research projects were you involved in your first stint here at the medical school?
Well, that was pretty all-encompassing, because I also had to spend the winters on Martha's Vineyard to do this work. I also, in my residency at Mass General, I became very concerned about the inmates, the health of inmates at the Charles Street Jail, which was our neighbor. And I became concerned about that, because we would see a fair number of psychiatric emergencies in the emergency room, usually inmates who had tried to hang themselves. And on going into the jail, which is a whole story unto itself, I discovered there really was very poor health care and no mental health care for inmates. So I worked on that as a research project for a number of years, but it was very difficult to get information and get support from my colleagues. So it was more of a frustrating effort than a successful one, I think.
Did you teach courses at the medical school?
Yeah, I did teaching, but that wasn't my career as a teacher. I mean, I taught because you had to teach, not because I wanted to teach. I wanted to do research, and that was my passion.
How did you go to Washington University, and was it
to do research? That in 1981, I got a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health. It was a career development award, it was called, and it basically paid 100% of my salary and freed me up to do anything I wanted to do. I mean, to go places other than Harvard, to gain experiences that I might not have if I stayed here. The world's leading epidemiologist, psychiatric epidemiologist, was at Washington University in St. Louis. Her name is Lee Robbins. And I wanted to spend a year working with Lee. And so the family agreed to that. So we went out to St. Louis with that in mind, that we would spend a short time. But what happened is that they started celebrating my accomplishments, and the medical school, the dean of the medical school, and the chair of the Department of Psychiatry started making overtures to what it would be like if I stayed and directed the division of child psychiatry at Washington University, and they did the same thing for my wife. You know, that she'd have a much bigger lab and more support. And so we kind of looked around and kind of stunned, you know, that at Harvard, you're just another shrimp in the ocean, you know, that it not only would I be able to do my research, because Washington University was a very research-oriented university, but I'd have this kind of authority and prestige to really shape a child psychiatry program in a way that I wanted to do, with absolute support from the medical school. So we took the offer to leave Harvard and to join the Department of Psychiatry. And we were there for not 1 year, but 7 years.
7 years?
Yeah.
Your overall major achievement during those 7 years, how would you capitalize?
Well, I did a lot of new research projects, you know. So the Vineyard Project was winding down, and there was a lot of research going on at Washington University. I worked with Lee Robbins to do studies on adolescent health. I did studies on children exposed to disaster. There was a big flood in the Missouri-Mississippi River Basin, and I had a chance to do disaster. We did one of the first studies of children's response to flooding as a disaster. I did studies on children whose parents were alcoholic. So it was a very fruitful, productive 7 years in which I branched out from the preschool work that I was doing. I mean, the work on preschool children I was doing. And successfully engaged in a number of other research projects.
You returned then to Harvard about 1989?
Yeah, we kind of went out to St. Louis thinking that St. Louis was in the Midwest. And after about a year or two, started to realize that St. Louis was Southern, more Southern than it was Midwestern. People's attitudes about race and interracial couples and that kind of stuff was way behind what it would be in New York or Boston. We didn't like what was happening with our kids that much, even though they were going to very good schools. And just decided, you know, this is not where we want to spend the rest of our lives. Washington University also was changing a little bit. It was getting much too biological for me. My interest, I mean, I respect and I think biology is extraordinarily important, but that's not my interest. My interest is how society functions and how to improve that. The university was becoming less and less committed to what I was committed to. So I decided to come back to Harvard on a sabbatical. 7 years, I'd earned a sabbatical from Washington University to look around again. Not necessarily to come back to Boston, because we did not have a love affair with Boston, but we had contacts here and friends here, and kids wanted to come here, that sort of thing. So I came back to Harvard, and the dean of the School of Public Health and the dean of the medical school and various other people lined up and made an offer to us as a family that we couldn't turn down. So we came back.
Here you are.
And here, you know, 1989, I came back and been here since. Yeah.
I have a quick question for you, Tony. Were you there in the Grand Rounds presentation of Leon Eisenberg at University of Washington that he labeled social psychiatry, is there any other kind, in response to Sam Gouzet's paper, biological psychiatry, is there any other kind? Sort of in a typical Leon Eisenberg-esque response, he took him on. And they were friends, I understand also. Were you there at that Grand Rounds, or that happened when you were in Boston?
It happened when I was in Boston. I know about it. That Leon would characterize his talks with very interesting and unique and penetrating titles. And there's another talk that he gave when I was there. It was about brainlessness and mindlessness. Which psychiatry do you want? You can't have both. So Leon had a deep respect for Sam Guzay and Eli Robbins and Lee Robbins, who were the main researchers there. And they had different opinions about things and were very forthcoming and articulate in expressing what those things were, those biases and those disagreements. But it was out of that bias and disagreement dialogue that was constantly there that I thought that it was a good department, a great department, that they could tolerate different interpretations coming from outside and hold to their own position, but have the flexibility to incorporate ideas from people like Leon. And Sam Guzay, who used to say that I talk like Leon, was very, I mean, they had a lot of respect for each other.
And of course, this is also the period of the DSM-3, the epidemiological catchment area studies, and Lee Robbins' influence, of course, is prominent. At the same time, almost like epidemiology was a bridge that essentially united psychiatry in some ways during this period.
The ECA, the epidemiology catchment area study, was a very important milestone in American history of psychiatry, and deserves to be on everybody's teaching agenda, I think. One of the studies I did on the ECA under Lee Robbins' guidance was to compare depression in African Americans with whites and other groups. And what we found is that the prevalence of major depressive disorder using DSM-3 was the same between whites and blacks. It was within 1 or 2 percentage points of each other. But Black people took a longer time to come for help, or didn't come for help at all, or used prayer and religion as a therapy. So that was a study showing that the biology of depression doesn't necessarily give you a clue to the sociology of depression.
Indeed. So we'll move on to the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, Part 1 and Part 2, and then the public's policy implications and the definition of collective efficacy, which I think is very important for people to listen to. And then, of course, using that in your work in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I will continue.
Let's talk about your major current research, the Chicago Project. We'll talk about some of the other research activities, but let's talk about that one.
Well, it was a major event, that I got involved in this research. I mean, partly because I was an accomplished scientist. There was a concern in the late 80s and early 90s that crime and violence in particular were out of control. Too many homicides. The crack cocaine epidemic was driving a lot of this. And then people started talking, people in criminal justice system, police and parole officers and that sort of thing, started talking about tough kids unlike they had ever seen before. And the term super predator cropped up as a label, on the kinds of crimes and the kinds of people, usually young Black men, who were committing these crimes. So I decided I wanted to get into this. you know, because that's not the way I saw it. I wanted to get into this mix, and an incredible opportunity arose, partly because of my connections at Washington University, to do what would be a landmark study that the Justice Department and the MacArthur Foundation and the National Institute of Mental Health combined interest and said, we would like to find the most outstanding scientist, social scientist in the United States or the world for that matter, to conduct a study someplace in the United States that would set it right, you know, to say what really are the contributions of individuals, families, and communities to this problem that we have, so that 10 years from now, we would be in a position to have knowledge, not just opinions, about what causes violence and how to address it. So from 1989, really, to now, gradually over a period of time, I organized groups of scientists, chose to work in Chicago after moving around the whole United States and thinking about, you know, Baltimore and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and whatever. And from 94 to 2002, we did a landmark study.
In Chicago?
In Chicago.
Why Chicago, not Boston?
Well, but Chicago is big, and as a city, it represents so many crucial elements of American society. It's got a large Black population that is organized at the neighborhood level in terms of income. So you have wealthy Black neighborhoods, as well as lots of poor Black neighborhoods. You have lots of immigrants from Mexico. You have Puerto Rican neighborhoods. In fact, it's the only city in the United States that has both Mexican and Puerto Rican neighborhoods. At least that was the case when we started. And it has whites who represent various stages of immigration to America, from Germans and Polish to Italian and so forth. So Chicago is America. Since we really wanted to dig in and understand one place, rather than doing a national study and trying to study every place, Chicago was sort of paradigmatic of what America is, what it's been, and what it's becoming. And that demographic picture of Chicago has served us very well. In other words, we think we made the right decision by going to Chicago.
What was your process, and what were your measurement tools as you began to look at the neighborhoods?
Well, you know, I knew a lot about measuring mental health and problems in children and their mothers and fathers, for that matter. What I didn't know much about is how to measure neighborhoods. That basically our thinking about neighborhoods was based on who lives there. So if it was a Black neighborhood, people were poor, you'd call it a Black poor neighborhood. Yeah, and you'd use income statistics and race statistics as if it was, you know, a reflection of what happened in that neighborhood. So the challenge, in a way, was to develop measures of communities that were independent of the composition of people who live there. And they wouldn't be biased by the composition of people who live there. So we developed measures for this study of trust and reciprocity, of, you know, taking care of other people's children, not just watching out for your own children, sharing resources, and a number of other kinds of measures. And did a study in Chicago in which we measured in detail characteristics of individual kids and their families, but also of their neighborhoods. And then asked the important question: now that you know all of this about a person growing up, what contribution does the neighborhood make to their outcome, independent of differences that they have as people and their families have in terms of how they're raising them? And most people thought that, look, you're not going to find very much, you know, that what's really important is the discipline of parents, you know, or the caretaking of parents or something like that. Or some kids are just born incorrigible and there's nothing that even a good parent can do. What we found in a very robust scientific way was that neighborhoods are very important. And that they operate in a number of ways. I mean, one way is that if people are fearful, they're not going to monitor other people's children very much. If the schools are not, if parents are not engaged in the schools are not going to function very well. Peer groups become gangs in those kinds of neighborhoods, and gangs, you know, develop a life of their own. So there are many ways in which neighborhood influences are profound, have profound impact on kids, particularly as they get into adolescence. And I think the Chicago study documented that as well as any studies ever done. And we started producing findings in 1997. And over the last decade, I think we've had enormous impact on public policy.
Tony, I have a quick question. This is a period where I think I knew how interested you were also in ethics, because tell us a little bit about the participatory ethics issues that you faced in Chicago and how you dealt with it in this study as you were observing the neighborhoods and others, because it was a very important phase of the implementation of the study, wasn't it?
Right. Well, there's a lot of suspicion that this big study that had a lot of money and prestige associated with it was being used by the government to spy on Black people and to make recommendations that were contrary to having goodwill towards African Americans. And I was singled out by Black psychologists at one point, the Association of Black Psychologists, as being a tool of the government. So that forced that made it even more important that we be open and candid and truthful about our purpose and our sources of money and influence. And so I became very interested in what's beyond the ethical criteria that we have, that we would use the existing ethical framework, but we wanted to go further than that. And one of the documents that influenced me greatly when I discovered it was the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It was ratified in 1990 by every country in the world except the United States. And to me, the convention is part of an ethical framework. It says that children have a right to these benefits, and governments are responsible to deliver them as best as they can. That statement and that position of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child became an ethical framework for everything we did in Chicago. And you'll see in our book that there's a very important transition we made from discovering collective efficacy, which we'll talk about more, I think, and the measurement of rights, of human rights, the importance of human rights for children in our work.
Yeah, I wanted to underscore that, I think, so the point doesn't get forgotten. This is a very important part that then goes on to the sub-Saharan work as well.
Mhm.
Okay.
What ways have your findings affected policy and practices in Chicago and other big cities?
Well, the first way was that we published a paper in Science in 1997 that demonstrated the importance of community characteristics like the ones I just told you about. We call that collective efficacy. Some people call it social capital. The then director of the National Institute of Justice converted our science article into a one-page brief that he sent to every police precinct in the United States and said, you know, basically that the federal government wants you to take cognizance of this research because it has very important implications for what we call community policing. You know, and the impact was varied according to people's readiness to take up community policing. But basically what the article did was legitimize community policing as a way to go. And many places in the United States now have very strong community policing programs that have at least a scientific base in some of the work that we did. But you know, the work has gone much further than community policing.
Go ahead.
For example, I just gave a keynote address to the Urban Libraries Council. So these are a group of librarians who work in cities who are interested in what contribution do libraries make or can libraries make to this thing that you call collective efficacy. You know, can libraries or do libraries function as an important resource in the community that strengthens the caretaking, the monitoring, the supervision, the career goal setting of children? Of course they do. Another organization that's been very interested are people who do urban planning and are particularly interested in land use for recreational purposes, for gardening. A few years ago, I gave a keynote address to an international convocation of urban gardeners. And what they see is that gardening brings together generations in neighborhoods. So, you know, it just keeps multiplying. Anybody who really cares about the growth of cities has some reference to the kind of work that we are
The
doing.
article in Science, that was co-authored with
By
Sampson.
Robert Sampson and Stephen Rodenbush.
Could you define for those who will use your interview collective efficacy? Could you define that as a theory?
We think of collective efficacy as the willingness of people to take needed action to benefit the neighborhood. So it's more than trusting your neighbors or more than being willing to share resources with a neighbor. It's the willingness to take social or political action that will prevent the problem perhaps from occurring or correct something which is a deficit. And we give concrete examples. I mean, for example, do you think, we ask neighbors or residents of a neighborhood, do you think that people who live around here would intervene, would do something if they saw a teenager disrespecting an adult in the streets, or starting a fight, or using drugs? Do you think that people who live in this neighborhood would do something if the city decided to remove a fire station? So there's a string of questions like that we measure and then form a scale of how active, how action-oriented people think their neighbors are. So we're not asking them if they would do it. We're asking them what is their perception of the action orientation of people who live around them. We then make a scale which goes from like blood pressure, from 0 to 100. And we use that value to correlate with other health outcomes. So how many homicides have there been in this community? How many people with asthmatic attacks, have reported to emergency rooms in this community? What's the birth rate of children born in this community? And what we have found, to our surprise, I might say, is that the correlation of collective efficacy with multiple kinds of health outcomes is always in the positive direction. It's always that the stronger the neighborhood in terms of its action orientation, the safer and healthier the environment is for children growing up.
You have done, or you're currently doing some work in Tanzania, looking at the psychological impacts of HIV/AIDS on children. I'd like you to talk about that research initiative. And is there a connection between your Chicago project methodology and what you're doing in Tanzania?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so in Chicago, we were working with what at the time was considered to be the most serious epidemic in American society, violence. We discovered, I might say, I don't think we knew, Chicago looked pretty bad to me when we started this research. I didn't think there was much collective efficacy of social capital in a city like Chicago. So I think we surprised ourselves with how strong the community effects were. And we were convinced that we had done a good job of measuring it. So finding that it's important, we knew it was based on good, solid measurement. So we had something there, and I looked around at how policymakers, how police and gardeners and librarians and urban planners and that sort of thing were taking up this finding and using it. And very much stuck in my face as an epidemiologist is the HIV/AIDS epidemic. If violence was the American problem of the 1990s, then HIV/AIDS has become the world's problem, and certainly the African problem in this, for the rest of this century, I would assume, without a vaccine being, for a long time we dwelled on the possibility in the 1990s that a vaccine would come along. But about 98, 99, it became clear that there's not going to be a vaccine for a long time. Going to have to deal with this epidemic behaviorally. And so what we very deliberately did was to go to the NIMH and say, look, we discovered something in Chicago. And my hunch is that it's applicable anywhere, under any, wherever people form communities, that we can measure this thing called collective efficacy. I want to do a study in Africa that goes beyond what we did in Chicago. In Chicago, all we did was observe that this occurred. In other words, there were lots of communities and lots of poor communities in Chicago that had high collective efficacy and low violence, despite the stereotyping. What I'd like to do is to design an experiment in Africa. So find an African city and experimentally see if I can increase collective efficacy in a group of neighborhoods that would translate into lower risk for HIV and less stigma for those people who are already infected. And so for the last 3 years, we've been working on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro in Moshi, Tanzania. It's a city of about 150,000 people. And we are applying what we learned in Chicago in an experimental design in Moshi.
So we'll come to Mount Kilimanjaro and the Mandela t-shirt. And I have the pictures, Tony. So before we move on, I just wanted to give credit to NIMH And I think at this time, Steve Hyman was the director of NIMH, I believe. And his support, he was our Norspitz-Klein lecturer just before the, in person, just before the onset of the COVID AACAP meeting. And also I wanted to acknowledge that the university that you wanted to go, Tony, instead of Howard, Northwestern, gave you a doctorate in Chicago, honorary doctorate of science, as well as you being chosen as the Mahatma Gandhi Fellow in the American Academy of Political and Social Science, serving on the International Human Rights Committee of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, on the board of directors of the Physicians for Human Rights and International Human Rights Network of Science Academies, and of course, all the work that you've been doing with Maya Carlson has been informed by this universal standards established in the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So, and so that's just a little footnote before we move on to the sort of miscellaneous section on your anti-apartheid work, musical interests, Charles Darwin, and some of the narration of the photographs.
Another activity that you've been involved in is the Harvard South African Fellowship Program. Would you tell us what that's about and what your involvement and role has been, how it relates to earlier interests and things that you experienced?
Well, in the 1980s, I mean, partly being a former resident of Boston, living in St. Louis, I became involved in the anti-apartheid movement, the international anti-apartheid movement, with a focus on Missouri, you know, and the university I was working at. And the issue was, how could we bring the divestment campaign to Missouri Congress, the Missouri University system, and Washington University as a private institution, and the city of St. Louis. And for 9 or 10 years, while I was living in St. Louis, and even after I moved out of St. Louis, my wife and I, you know, sort of led a campaign that effectively got Missouri to become the 24th state to divest pension funds and the university system and the city of St. Louis. When I came to Harvard, I discovered this program that had been around for 20 years or so, and was Harvard's answer to divestment. Harvard never divested. Rather, it invested, constructive engagement, I think it was called, in bringing mid-career disadvantaged Africans to Harvard to study. And it was a blemish, actually, for those of us who were involved in divestment, because our concern was not individuals, it was structural reform. But as I stayed at Harvard, and South Africa was liberated and now is being transformed, I made a decision a few years ago to direct the South Africa Fellows Program as a way of helping to reconstruct that society. So every year, we screen carefully in South Africa and bring 6 to 8 mid-career professionals to Harvard to study for a year. And I've done that now for the last 4 or 5 years. It's kind of a connection, you know, with the new South Africa, given my efforts to bring down the old South Africa.
Thank you.
Yeah, 4 or 5 kind of wrap-up questions. The first is there anything else you'd like to add to this interview that I've not asked you about?
The only thing that resonates throughout my whole life is music, you know, and I don't think I've told you very much about the fact that I play music. I played music since I was 5 years old. And by the time that I was about 12, playing clarinet and flute and saxophone, discovered that I wasn't very good, that my ears weren't very good. and that particularly for improvisation, that I was handicapped. I mean, you know, it's sort of like a crippled person. The problem with not having good pitch is that there are no crutches. I mean, it's a hard problem to overcome. And so I really think of myself as somebody who was destined to be a musician, who, because of a handicap, ended up being a scientist.
You're not doing any music today, or you listening?
Well, I'm listening all the time. Yeah, I go
What do
to
you like
jazz
to listen to?
performances, and well, lots of people. Sonny Rollins, you know, is somebody who I've been close to for, I mean, musically close to for 40 years now. Sonny is 76, so I catch him every time I can. But I like, you know, I mean, Miles Davis is on my wall. I love Keith Jarrett, and you know, there's a whole cluster of people who I follow very closely.
Beyond your work as a medical scientist, what do you still want to do that you haven't done outside of your professional?
Well, my hero, we also haven't talked about who my hero is. My hero is Charles Darwin. You know? And in fact, there's a book that was just published called My Heroes. There's a project, something like yours, that goes around interviewing people about who their heroes are. And my story about Charles Darwin is in this book. I also discovered that Wynton Marsalis's hero is Duke Ellington, which I think is perfect, you know. What I haven't had time to do is write and reflect, or reflect and write. And this is what, I mean, I admire Darwin because at an early stage of his career, he collected all of the data he really ever needed and spent time away from the academy, you know, not being a part of a university, not going off to London to the National, to the Royal Geographic, or whatever it was, you know, but carefully assembling his understanding, and as a product of that, changing the world. I mean, Darwin to me is the greatest scientist who ever lived. Now, I'm not going to change the world, you know, but I admire the capacity of a person to take themselves out of the pressures and be able to construct and assemble, you know, a complex issue in a way that uniquely fits your understanding of it. I'd like to have the opportunity to do that in the next part of my career.
After the next segment on the hopes and concerns for the African American community, I like to come back to Gordon's comment on Tanzania about the effects and the outcome of the efforts in collective efficacy. So I'll just show the next segment, and then we can come back to that question from Gordon. Sorry, I'll just do that one.
What are your hopes and or concerns for the African American or Black communities in our country today?
Well, one aspiration I have is for African Americans to feel a claim on the society in which they live. A claim that can be expressed in one way through reparations, but a sense of citizenship, a sense of membership, you know, that goes back to my grandfather, who fought in France on the Maginot Line. And yeah, I told you the story of how I saw my grandfather position himself in American society and kind of resolve in a certain way that this was a benefit that he had had from fighting. But I think that, working in Chicago and knowing poor communities and disenfranchised communities around the country, being involved in civil rights, that we haven't finished this fight at all. That there are too many kids who grow up still feeling marginalized. I mean, the thing that really gets to me in Chicago is to see Mexicans coming into Chicago, taking any job, anywhere, under any circumstances, making any amount of money, but consolidating that effort within the family, within the community to push themselves ahead, leaving behind African-American kids who don't feel like they have a stake. I'm not going to take that job. I'm not going to do that work, so on and so on. But the consequence of it is that they don't make a claim and they get left out.
So, Gordon, do you want to comment on the your question regarding Tanzania in person, if you're on? Or
Sure, Kerim. And Tony, I just thought that you talked about the idea behind the Tanzania study in Moshi, but you didn't say did it achieve its goal. When I read the book, I thought that was the really big take home, that the intervention you achieved did achieve something.
Well, I think this interview at the History Makers took place in 2005 or 2006. I'm not sure. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And we didn't know the results of the Tanzanian study when I was being interviewed here.
yeah, sure. Yeah.
We knew it was working, that the experiment.
Because I think the folks who are listening to this may not be familiar with it. It's really fantastic results.
It's a very important study, yeah. I mean, we showed that children can help communities create higher levels of collective efficacy by being junior scientists. They would carry the message of HIV testing and HIV treatment and prevention to the community using drama and music and group meetings to teach and inspire the community about the prevention of HIV, and through that mechanism are raising the level of collective efficacy in the neighborhood that we measured. And so what we've discovered and published around 2012, about 5 years after this tape was made, was the successful
Oh, we lost Johnny. I think we lost Tony. So, okay. What I like to do is to show you the photographs that I mentioned since Tony is not here, and then we can take him back when he comes. Here we go.
I like this picture and I use it as my first one because it's about a community. In this case, the community is a band. It's a band that I grew up with. The location is 2nd Street in New Orleans. And on the right side of the picture here is my uncle Oscar, who was the band leader. These are not kids from a particular school, it's an after-school program. The building that we are seated in front of is a building that my uncle built himself. And that our band studio was inside that building. I am submerged in my community. I am on the far left with a clarinet in my hand, even though I'm not highly distinguished because I'm at the end of the photograph. In fact, I am the first clarinetist in the band. So that's Felton III. You know, much of my career my career as a scientist started out studying 3-year-olds. In this picture, I'm 3 years old. I'm very neatly dressed because I think my mother was putting all of her energies into her attachment with me and my attachment with her. I was very well taken care of. I'm looking off in the distance in that photograph, wondering where my father is. My father's in the Philippines, probably, fighting in World War II. Yeah. That's my mother in New Orleans, in the French Quarter, in the garden of a hotel. It's one of the last pictures I have of my mother being healthy. She's about 75 in that picture. At the last 5 years of her life, she had a number of different ailments. So it's a very important picture for me. I mean, first of all, she's beautiful. The garden's beautiful. And it's a way I really want to remember her. This is my family 2 or 3 years after moving from New Orleans to Memphis, Tennessee. My father is there. And at this point, this is probably the peak of his career. I mean, he's a very important postal official. There's Philip on his lap and Carol, who's sitting between my mother and my father. My mother, and I'm a high school student, probably 10th grade at Booker T. Washington High School. Len, my younger sister, hasn't been born yet. So that's the Earls sibling clan at the funeral of my mother. I'm standing in front of Carol, my sister, who lives in Detroit now. Philip is standing next to me. Philip lives in Virginia Beach. And Len, who's now been born for a long time, lives in Atlanta. So there are 4 of us. The year is 1974. It's a house that we rented in London, and it's one of the happiest days of my life. There I am as a father holding my youngest daughter, Tanya, who was just born. I mean, she's probably about, I don't know, maybe a month old in that picture, but still very, very new and very, very beautiful. So this is a photograph of the extended family now at my mother's funeral about 5 years ago in Memphis, Tennessee. What's important about this picture is that a lot of the extended family, cousins, are from New Orleans. And so it was one of the rare moments where the New Orleans contingent of the family has come together with those of us who were marooned in Memphis to have a moment as everybody, the whole family there. I'm standing on the left-hand side of the picture in front of my wife, Mary, and there's Philip and Carol and Len and cousins from New Orleans, none of whom right now are in New Orleans because of Hurricane Katrina. So Charlene's in one place and Petra's in another place, and they're kind of all around the United States. Well, this is a great moment in my career. This is an open house conducted in 1994 in Chicago that is inaugurating our Chicago project. And we invited people from the state legislature, Carolyn Moseley Brown, who was then senator from Illinois, and lots of other sort of important people. We had about 200, 250 people there to sort of christen the beginning of the Chicago project. This is another one of the happier moments in my life. There I am walking my first daughter, Lee, an adopted daughter I had from my marriage with Mary, down the aisle in a church here in Cambridge. And it was in some ways a signal of extraordinary success we had as an interracial family in having Lee sort of reach this moment in her life. Well, I said that I should have been an activist, and this photograph represents a moment when my activism was at its peak. I call it grounding with my brothers. That Dumasani Kamalo, standing on the right, was the leader of the American divestment campaign. He's South African during the 1980s and into the 90s. Dumasani is now the UN ambassador from South Africa to the United Nations. A person standing immediately to my right is Joe Trole, who at that time was one of the leading radical journalists in South Africa. And next to him is a very famous photographer whose name is Kumalo, who's probably made the most important photographic collections of Nelson Mandela. But it was a political moment where we were kind of meeting in an airport and exchanging ideas about whether or not the divestment campaign was working or not. Well, one of the ways in which I have fun is driving my Porsche. When I first met my wife, she had a Porsche, and she had a couple of them. And so over the years, we have gotten to know these cars pretty well. This is one of those days in which I was racing my car, but I just wanted to show it because I think it's important to know how people have fun. You know? This is a photograph I like because it's reflecting my clinical role, my clinical professionalism in some ways. That for 7 years I directed the Division of Child Psychiatry at Washington University. And I had many patients and had many students, and this photograph kind of reflects that period in my life when I was a clinician as well as a scientist. Well, I told a bit of a story about my being a conscientious objector in the 1970s. And I showed this article because there was a point at which it looked like I wasn't going to make it, that the Army was going to draft me and send me to Korea and Vietnam. And I had a choice to make, which was to go to jail. And I thought very, very seriously about that and was basically prepared to do that when the Boston community chimed in. And one of the people who was very helpful to me was Ed Brooke, who learned about my story, knew that I was working at the Charles Street Jail in Boston, and wrote the Army and said, we're going to send this guy there, but we want you to process his claim efficiently. We think he's a conscientious objector, and we don't want you to dally around and have him going off to Korea or Vietnam if he's not supposed to. So I went, I reported to active duty in San Antonio, not knowing what the hell was going to happen. Saw a chaplain, saw a psychiatrist, saw a bunch of other people, and within 5 weeks, I was discharged. But it was because Ed Brooke was calling up the Army every day saying, where do things stand today?
That disappeared where?
This is a Boston Globe, yeah. That picture was taken in 1991, just after Mandela was released. And we're giving him a photograph of, that's my wife, Mary there. And we're giving him a photograph of a T-shirt that says "Free Nelson Mandela," that we held up as a banner at 19,000 feet at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro 3 years earlier. in 1987 or 1986, when we climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, we were convinced that Mandela would not make it out of jail, that he'd die, and that we wanted to symbolize his importance by taking him to the top of Africa. And 4 years later, I had an opportunity to meet him, and I've met him since then. I said Charles Darwin was my hero. That's still true, but probably before I die, I'll convert to Nelson Mandela as my hero. He's a remarkable, I would say, probably the most remarkable person in the 20th century, given what he went through and what he's contributed all his life to the world.
It's true.
So I have 2 more segments, if you can bear with me.
Is there anything that you have done already that you think you might have done differently during your lifetime?
It's a good question. Yeah. In 1974, I was in London, but I really had no strong intentions of coming back to the United States. Another part of my history, which we didn't talk about, is that from 1970, when I went back into medicine, came out of the lab, I was drafted. And I knew there was no way I was going to serve in the United States Army. It just was completely, off the page. And so for 3 years, I struggled in court to define myself as a conscientious objector. And it was hard. I mean, I ended up winning in a lower court, and the Army appealed it, and I basically had to either go to jail or report to active duty. And I did finally convince the Army in 1973 that I was a conscientious objector, and I got an honorable discharge. But in going back in life to that time, partly because of civil rights and partly because of the activism, that I had to marshal to become a conscientious objector. I had defined myself as an activist, but I made a decision that being a scientist, having a primary identity as a scientist was what I was going to pursue. And so living around Mel King and a bunch of other people, who I admired, made it very clear to me that I was making a different decision, that I was going to stay in the university, that I was going to put my efforts into publishing papers and collecting data and that sort of thing. And I'm not totally satisfied with that. I think that the issue of war, of people fighting and killing each other, and the more civilians and the more children that are killed in these kinds of wars that we fight these days, the angrier and the more hopeless I get. So I could have had a career that would have been an anti-war career, and as an activist, and devoted the energy I devote to science to that. And sometimes I think I would that I would have been more effective and done more good if I had been an activist.
Just to continue on that theme, and you've in part answered this question, but how do you feel about the way that you've lived your life?
Well, I think I've been too, I think I've made too many concessions to universities. This again reflects my admiration of Charles Darwin. Universities make you compromise in various ways. Now, I've been very successful in what I've done and what I've pursued. And I could not have done the university. I could not have done the Chicago project outside of the university and so forth. But I'm also very conscious of the compromises that I've made by being part of a system, part of the university system, even though it's a university system that has afforded me a lot of flexibility, whatever.
Final segment from the history makers.
Last question. How do you want to be remembered?
As a scientist, you know, as somebody who had a passion in chemistry and converted that passion into being a scientist of society that took a very rigorous approach derived from working in laboratory and working in natural sciences, but took the rigor of that and the caring and sensitivity that my mother gave me about people. And, you know, kind of converged or collapsed or integrated those two perspectives, caring for people and being rigorous, into a career.
I will stop sharing. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I noticed that we have had the same attendance numbers throughout. It's been fantastic. Thank you for your attention. And I have one more video segment to show, which I think is a very historical one. I mentioned to Tony with Carola, which is a special moment. I would like to share that with you at the end. But you know, almost, Tony, you are a scientist activist or an activist scientist, as it were. Sort of, you have also, in many ways, have stayed out of the limelight in the university, in as much as you know, I remember you in Cambridge and Harvard Square, and as opposed to the niche of the medical area. So, and also your travels, your international work towards later years has been really inspiring. And I think my projection about collective efficacy sort of goes back to New Orleans. It's almost like that chorus with the first clarinetist sitting and your uncle on the other side, and amazing photograph. So it kind of I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I'm kind of trying to put it together, and it seems so coherent. Your choices of where you went throughout your academic life, your journey has been so impressive. And one wonders, you know, in terms of University of Wisconsin in Madison, neurobiology, where you met Samir Zaki, who became one of the most prominent neuroscientists at University College in the UK, where you met Mary, but also Leon Eisenberg's first wife, where she told you to sort of about some of the prospects that you could follow, and then your training in pediatrics, which was quite novel and courageous in Harlem, and moving on to MGH with Leon, and moving on to Great Ormond Street, the very famous hospital, what we call the Peter Pan's Hospital in London. And of course, even, you know, your side trip to McGill to do neurosurgery and neurology is kind of interesting, because they have such an amazing institute on neurology and neurosurgery, and your work with Stella Chess. So these are not random choices, Tony. They're choices that require tremendous insight into what's going on around you scientifically. Also your foresight in terms of the work that followed later on in terms of University of Washington and Lee Robbins' influence. I have a photograph of you with Lee Robbins and Chet Pierce and Leon that I will show at the end. We have about like few minutes left, but I just wanted to open the floor for discussion in case anyone has any comments before I go to that segment, because the session is going to end about 15 minutes. So if you have anything to say, please do, and then I will show the final segment. And
Here's David Klein to say a word.
Yes.
I'm so struck with the apparent ease with which you accomplished all these things. I mean, it's really marvelous. And we begin by saying a search of excellence and exceptionalism was what we sought. And here you've been such a wonderful example of this. I mean, it's just absolutely marvelous, all the things you've achieved and contributed to our welfare. So thank you.
Gordon, yeah.
One comment I'd make on Kerim and Tony at the end is, as the two speeches by Guzet and Eisenberg that we talked about, and that the only psychiatry is social psychiatry, the only psychiatry is biological. It illustrates the challenge in our field of balancing these different ways of approaching human life and human development, human suffering. And what's really nice about the summary, Kerim, that you've organized of Tony's work is it shows how Tony has worked around this balance, working on the one side, work on the other, and never disparaging or dismissing the side that he's not working in. And that's a really strong point. It's interesting that when you're talking about Leon and how often Leon would fulminate about psychoanalysis, Leon, as Tony remembers, had in the department and kept in the department some terrific analysts as teachers and facilitators of group interaction. And Ed Messner was the great one who helped the residents function as a group, a complete analyst. He wasn't dismissive of biological psychiatry. And I think it's that successful balancing that Tony represents, and we have a chance, have had a chance through this talk to share with and let be inspiring to others.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, so let me share a few more slides with photographs and end with the clip from Carola and Tony together. First is a photograph of the old Shrewsbury School in the UK, Charles Darwin's childhood. Interested in childhood? That's a childhood. And his comment that I borrowed from the comment that Tony selected on his chapter, after the power of language had been acquired and the wishes of the community could be expressed, the common opinion of how each member ought to act for the public good would naturally become, in a paramount degree, the guide for action. And I know that Tony is a big admirer of Abraham Lincoln. And this is not a quote from the Gettysburg Address, but it reflects again, with malice toward none, with charity for all, which I think is a great comment on his admiration for Lincoln. And this is a picture that we took in 2018. I took the photograph at the Leon Eisenberg Award that was held, the award ceremony was held with Carola in the town of Lincoln, Massachusetts, where she was in a resting home. She's 101 years old, and she died this year at 104. She was the founder of the Physician for Human Rights, as well as a dean of education at Harvard Medical School, as well as Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a great sort of observer, and wife of Leon Eisenberg, who Leon admired greatly. And I think it is reflected in the tape that I'm going to show you. Okay.
I cannot tell you the pleasure that this gives me. First, because I see you, because with our complicated and busy lives, we haven't seen each other as much recently. But it's particularly pleasing to me, and I kept thinking throughout the day how Leon would have loved to give you, at your request, this award, because you were one of his very, very, very favorite disciples, or whatever you want to call it.
It's a good word, disciple.
He really was excited. He came one day to tell me that he had had lunch with you, and the pleasure that I gave him when you talk about common problems that society was facing. And unfortunately, Leon, as you, the audience might know, died a few years ago, so they were very kind, the organizers and givers of this award, to give you this that represents the love and respect that all of us have for you, and we should continue for many years to come to functions like this one, and the ones will be next week. So with my best wishes for a long life, and for a happy, productive rest of your life. And I'm talking from the point of view of a person that has lived very many, many years, and at the age of 101, still has happy moments as this one is. So with best wishes, here is the award, which I would love to show you, to show it in the movie, and particularly to give it to you, and to thank all of you who give this award every year and doesn't get tired. I don't know why, I guess because they are so young. With my best wishes, and many thanks for the life that you have had, for the ambitious, I'm sorry, that many wishes that your life could continue to be as productive.
I have to tell you the truth. The truth is that this is the second time I've gotten the Leon Eisenberg Award. So the first time I got it was January the 1st of 1971, when Leon took me in and I became his student, his mentee. That was an award worth everything to me. I mean, it changed it gave meaning to my career and structure to my career. So this is energizing. This award is energizing. To keep it up.
Thank you very much for sharing with me the memories of a marvelous relationship you have had, and for the organization of which you are the most.
So hold on. All right. Sorry, I stopped there. I don't like to take any credit for anything. So, all right. So let me go to the book. Okay. So this is the picture that's worth 1,000 words, right, Tony? This is the moment in 1987 that you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, and that's the photograph that you were sharing with Nelson Mandela. And it's a wonderful photograph. Free Nelson Mandela, African National Council, South Africa, with Maya Carlson. And this is the presentation that I wanted to show. And I want to stop sharing because we're going to end in just a few minutes. And I want to thank everyone for participating. I know that Jim McGough is here. Thank you, Jim, for joining us. And I really appreciate this media theater being part of the Academy meeting. It's it's a pleasure to share with you our knowledge of Tony, which I think that has been, for me, and someone interested in epidemiology and psychiatry, child psychiatry, developmental medicine. I think it's been a terrific inspiration for me, and the collateral inspirations that Leon and others have provided as well. I really appreciate the opportunity to be sharing these with you. I also want to thank David Klein in particular for inspiring this whole series, Gordon for his support for this program, and I see that Alice is also on the video. Nice to see you. So any other final comment, Johnny, you want to say? We have just a few minutes.
Well, I think, Tony, it's an honor to have you with us. And today's been a long first day for us to be live, but there's a great crowd here, really eager to learn and hear from you. So continued best wishes to all of us.
Thank you, Jim. Tony, want to say anything?
May I thank you, Gordon and David, for organizing this. It's been an extremely evocative event for me to see my life paraded across the screen and to realize all the people who have contributed to my well-being and my success as a child psychiatrist. So thank you very much. It's really been an extraordinary event for me.
Thank you. The event is recorded, and I hope we'll be able to share it in due course for people to see. It's a very historical moment. And again, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a great meeting. Thank you, Academy of Child Psychiatry and Adolescent Psychiatry. It's been a terrific honor to serve. Thank you. Have a nice evening. The rest. Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.